Wow, thank you, music team. And thank you to the many, many other volunteers and people who make these worship services possible. Yes. I'd also like to thank Reverend Aaron for inviting me to come back to speak to you. I'd also like to give a shout out and thanks to my wife, Debbie, who a lot of times is the one keeping our household on the spiritual beam. I remember I had just been accepted into the ministerial program, and Debbie came up to me and said, "Rick, we should put in for student housing." I looked at her and I said, "What do you want to do, live in a dorm room with our daughter Rachel for 3 years?" Debbie said, "Rick, this is Unity Village. They own houses, don't they?" I turned to her and I said, "Yeah, they own houses, but they only rent those houses to Grand Shamokas. I'm not a Grand Shamoka." Debbie looked at me and said, "Rick, where are your Unity principles? Prosperity, abundance. Tell them exactly what we want and fill out a form." Now, I want you to know, in my household, I always get the last word. So I turned to Debbie and said, "Yes, dear." And I proceeded to fill out the form. Wanted, single family, detached house, 3 bedrooms. I'm sitting there thinking, this is a colossal waste of time. I push the send button, off it goes. And then a month later, lo and behold, back from Unity Village comes this email saying, "Mr. Belous, Dr. Belous, we have the house just for you, meets all your specifications, and it sits on 1.5 acres of land. And the rent they wanted to charge us, my God, you haven't seen rents like that since Muhammad Ali was pulling off Howard Cosell's toupee." I mean, and the best part of the house, I must say, best part of the house, when we got here, we found out it was just down the road from a house where Charles Fillmore lived. You look at this house, and you look at some of the houses of some modern spiritual leaders, so-called spiritual leaders today, and my take on it, some of them are obscene mega mansions. You look at Charles Fillmore's house, it's humble, it's a beautiful cottage. It kind of looks like a cottage that Kincaid would have painted. Right? You look at that house, and you just know in your bones that Myrtle and Charles were the real deal. The title of my talk today is Better Living Through Chemistry. Now, those of you who were children of the 1960s will remember that phrase, better living through chemistry. But don't worry, the statutes of limitations have expired. I mean, even Jeb Bush is talking about things he did 40 and 50 years ago. But fortunately, the chemistry I'm going to be talking to you is a little different. As a matter of fact, in Unity, we call it chemicalization. And probably the best way I can get into this is by telling you a little bit about my spiritual journey. Hopefully it will resonate with some of you, but we'll really get into the process of chemicalization. My father died when I was 17 years old. Now, it's not unusual for a young man to idolize his father, and I certainly idolized my father. My father was born in the old country, in a place called Bessarabia. Bessarabia is a sliver of land that is right in between Russia and Romania. And my father said that back before they discovered oil in Bessarabia, Russia and Romania used to have wars over the territory, and the loser had to take the territory. My father came to America when he was 7 years old. He was very bright and hardworking, got a scholarship to an Ivy League school, graduated from an Ivy League law school. But then my father did something very different. Took the road less traveled by. He didn't become a corporate lawyer. He became a lawyer for workers, for labor unions, for the NAACP. One of my father's favorite cases, for the little guy, was the songwriter who was suing Elvis Presley for stealing All Shook Up. And the case was settled out of court, very nicely. So my father certainly was a crusader. And when my father died at 17, I thought, if God's not going to lift a finger, I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't want to have anything to do with organized religion. Matter of fact, I remember going outside one day, looking up at the sky and saying, God, go blank yourself. Now, a number of years ago, I apologized for that, and I was apologizing to Spirit and saying, I was so sorry that I ever said such a thing. Now, I don't hear this kind of stuff from Spirit every day, but call it higher power, call it higher self, call it what you will. I heard deep down inside, Rick, do not apologize for that. That was honest and heartfelt communications. May all our communications be that heartfelt and that open. So back then, well, what was I? I mean, I guess on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I was an atheist. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I was an agnostic. Sunday, I slept in so late it didn't matter what I was. It sort of reminds me of the story Woody Allen used to tell. Woody Allen said he had to break up with his girlfriend on religious differences. He was an atheist and she was an agnostic. Believe me, having a relationship with God was not on my bucket list by any stretch of the imagination. And then lo and behold, I had a deep spiritual experience. I read about something that C.S. Lewis had written about his conversion, and it was very, very similar to the process of conversion that C.S. Lewis went through. The great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, up over his door in his house in Zurich, Switzerland, he carved the following: called or not, God will be there. And I think that really honestly is true. So now came the fun and games. Because somehow I knew deep down inside that this spiritual path, I wasn't to be the Lone Ranger, that it was deeply important for me to be in a spiritual community. So, believe it or not, I wound up in a Pentecostal church. And I got to tell you, there are many things to this day that I deeply admire about this Pentecostal church. Remember when those of you who were here when Eddie Watkins Jr. was here a while ago? Yeah, Eddie Watkins, he was talking and he said, Pentecostal. And then Eddie Watkins said, what I'm trying to found is Metacostal, But anyway, what did I love about this Pentecostal church? Well, one, I have never been in such a deeply integrated environment. I mean, socially, racially, ethnically. I mean, we had people from Yale and we had people from jail. I mean, it was that integrated. The other thing is, this was a community which really believed in the reality of God and the healing spirit of God. This was a place which was filled with spiritual grandmothers. And the order of the service, boy, there was no written order of the service. It just flowed. It just flowed. Now, there were all those wonderful things. Let's say there was some other side to this Pentecostal church which, let's take their politics and their social views. Their politics and social views were somewhat to the right of Attila the Hun. And, Darwin was the devil and the earth's 10,000 years old, and I'd be sitting there thinking, let me out of here, So next, I wind up in a progressive church in terms of the social gospels, right on, spiritually just right on. However, there are no spiritual grandmothers in this place. And when it comes time for prayer, they're kind of sort of praying to whom it may concern. And I thought, when if push comes to shove, I'm going to need a lot more than to whom it may concern. And then one day I got a phone call from my good friend Gordon, and Gordon said, Rick, I think I found a solution to our church problem. I've been going to this Unity church for the last month. And I said, Gordon, come on, I've been to the Unitarian church. He said, no, not Unitarian, Unity. Why don't you come with me this Sunday? And so I came with him. It was my home church, now my home church, Unity of Fairfax, outside of Washington, D.C. And I fell in love. I felt that I had come home. Here was a community which was open to the bright winds of the Spirit, that believed in the reality of Spirit, believed that the age of miracles is not past. It was a community which, in terms of progressiveness and the social gospel, was spot on. And it was a community which was filled of not only spiritual grandmothers, but spiritual grandfathers. And I took to this place like a duck takes to water. Now, let me step aside and make a side comment on this. If it wasn't for that phone call from my good friend Gordon, I don't know whether I'd be in a Unity church today. Now, look, let's face it, we're not a proselytizing church, and I'm not trying to get us to be a super proselytizing church. But maybe there's somebody like Gordon knew me. Maybe there's somebody you know who could use Unity, who could be open to Unity Village Chapel. I would ask you, call them, invite them here, come with them. If I could dip into my Jewish roots, there's the Hebrew word for today is mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment or doing a good deed. Do a mitzvah. Call that somebody. Invite them. Help them to explore and experience unity. So anyway, I came to my Unity church, and it was like a duck coming to water. I went out and bought Emily Cady's Lessons in Truth, took classes, and there was great progress coming on. And this is not unusual. I know many of us have experienced people who were suicidally depressed before they came into Unity. They come into Unity, and now they're really feeling what Jesus called the peace that passes all understanding. That's not unusual. And we're seeing real spiritual growth and incredible things that are starting to happen in our lives. I remember one day I was in the car with a friend who had been in New Thought for a good number of years, and it's going to deal with traffic jams and traffic problems. And to quote that great spiritual teacher, Joan Rivers, can we talk a second? I love Kansas City. Go Royals and all that. I really love Kansas City. But when you guys talk about a traffic jam, you're talking about going maybe 20 miles an hour. Back east where I come from, a traffic jam is gridlock with nothing moving, for hours, and finding a parking space. So here we are at Tyson's Corner, the big shopping mall outside Washington, D.C. It takes 40 minutes to find a place to park. And my New Thought friend turns to me and says, "Oh yeah, parking spaces are the easiest thing in the world to metaphysically materialize." And she steps back, and next thing I know, there's a parking space right in front of the main door to Tyson's Corner. I was absolutely blown away. Now, so many of us, we come in here and we go through what I would call our metaphysical honeymoon, our New Thought pink cloud. We're cooking with gas and things are getting better and everything else like that. And then one morning, we wake up and there is a hitch in our giddy app. Maybe it's a health challenge. Maybe somebody in your family, maybe it's you, are told you have cancer. Or a husband has Alzheimer's. Or maybe the love relationship which you thought would never dissolves, and the next thing you know, you're in the middle of a messy divorce and custody battle. Or maybe your company's starting to downsize. Oh my goodness, what happened to this great financial flow and everything else like that? There's a real hitch in your giddy app. I remember one time a young woman came into Unity, and this was her first love relationship since coming into Unity. And she turned to me and said, "Rick, I know how ridiculous this is, but I just wanted to yell at the man. You can't leave me. I'm a true student." What happens to many of us when we go through this is we start going down the tubes. And we start getting feelings like, oh, this Unity stuff is a bunch of happy babble. This New Thought happy babble. Or in my particular case, the voice of error thought that came up to me was, "Rick, you've always been icky Ricky, and no amount of metaphysical bubble bath is going to wash that one, wash that one away." So, what's really interesting is that Emily Cady in Lessons of Truth and other pioneers in Unity have talked exactly about this process, and it's called chemicalization. What happens, says Emily Cady and others, is that our rocket starts taking off. We start spiritually growing. But as we start spiritually growing, things start happening. And, something happens. Some O-ring in our metaphysical rocket is not fully geared or whatever. And what she unfortunately says, many crash and burn, but that doesn't have to be the process. What we can do is look at what's going on. As what Jesus said, count it all joy. And that through this process, there can be a chemicalization going on. And what's forming is the pearl of great price. And out of that great pearl of great price will come a wonderful spiritual truth. And we will be lifted spiritually to a new dimension. Jesus spoke about this very much in the parable of the sowers, where he talked about the sower sows seeds, and some of the seeds land on rocky soil. Don't worry, that's not you. You wouldn't be here today if it was rocky soil and it didn't take. But he did say that some of the seed starts to grow, but its shoots are so small, its roots are so small, the first storm comes and these seeds just get blown away. Just get blown away. And this process of chemicalization, which can lead to that pearl of great price and greater things. It's, you could say, well, why do I have to go through chemicalization? I mean, didn't the enlightened masters sort of get around it and go beyond that? No. The enlightened masters also went through this process of chemicalization. Let me give you a few examples. The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul saw many, many wonderful spiritual victories. And yet he wrote that there was a thorn, his words, there was a thorn in his flesh. We don't know what that thorn was. We don't know. Modern Bible scholars have tried to theorize what that thorn might have been. But there was a thorn in his flesh which no amount of prayer or whatever would take that thorn out of his flesh. Did Paul go down the tubes? I'm sure he went through the long, dark night of the soul. But finally, what came to Paul was Spirit said to him, I am made perfect in weakness. I am made perfect in weakness. And Paul then could write and say that when I am weak, then I am strong. Or to translate into 21st century argot, when finally I realized that my flimsy and frail ego is not going to save my Paducah, it's at that point that my heart can break and that I am finally, at long last, teachable and open to the bright winds of the Spirit. Chemicalization. What about Jesus? Well, my goodness, Jesus' entire life was an example of chemicalization. Jesus said, if I'm lifted up, well, yeah, he was lifted up, and incredible things happened. But he also drew an awful lot of opposition. There were a lot of enemies. And eventually, this circle of enemies led to crucifixion. But from crucifixion came a process of chemicalization which led to resurrection. Now, I don't care whether you take resurrection literally or metaphysically or some combination of the two. But the story of resurrection is a powerful, powerful story of chemicalization. Christianity has no monopoly on this process of chemicalization. We see it in all the great religions. One of my favorite stories is a Buddhist story about a young woman who started to make some real spiritual progress, but then her child died. She came to the Buddha and asked the Buddha to bring her child back to life. And the Buddha said, yes, but first, you bring me 2 grains of rice from a household that has not tasted of death. So she went out looking for those 2 grains of rice. And you know what? She couldn't find a single household that had not tasted of death. And it was at that point that wasn't just head knowledge for her, it was finally heart knowledge. She truly realized the first two truths of Buddha's great noble truths, Four Noble Truths. She realized that in many ways life is dukkha, life is suffering, life is discontent. And the second noble truth, the suffering, the dukkha, comes from tanha, craving, thirst, lust, saying that our ego saying that life has to be a particular way, it has to be this way or the highway. And it was at that point that she went back to the Buddha. And this woman founded the first Buddhist monastic order for women. A case, I think, very much of chemicalization. Let's move forward. What about Myrtle Fillmore? I think the Myrtle Fillmore story is clearly a case of chemicalization. Myrtle Fillmore was interested in spiritual things from the get-go. From the get-go. I mean, when she and Charles were in Colorado in the wilds there, a lot of times she felt that, and she said, I think many Native Americans are much closer to the one power and one presence than many of my Christian friends, middle-class Christian friends back home. And so, great spiritual truth. And yet, here she has tuberculosis. And I think a lot of times when we talk about Myrtle Fillmore, we don't emphasize strongly enough. We make it sound like Myrtle Fillmore had a chest cold, and she was relieved of this chest cold. A great writer, and actually he's a doctor and physician and surgeon and teacher at Columbia University. His name is Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee. He wrote a book recently called The Emperor of All Maladies, which is the history of cancer. Now, Mukherjee said that, in our day and age, he believes cancer is the emperor of all maladies. But he said that wasn't always so. That wasn't always so. He said a lot of people died before they could even, cancer could even take hold in the old days. He said, for example, in the 1800s, I would say probably tuberculosis was the emperor of all maladies. So that's what Myrtle had. Myrtle had what for her day and her age was the emperor of all maladies. And she could have gone down the tubes and said, I've been spiritual, all my life. I've had these great truths and everything, and here I have tuberculosis, and I've been told I don't have more than probably a year to live, and down the tubes. That's not what happened to Myrtle. Myrtle was open to that process of chemicalization, and was at that lecture where she heard, you're a child of God and do not inherit sickness. And something came alive for her, really alive for her, and it led to her recovery. Myrtle died in 1931, and it had absolutely nothing to do with tuberculosis. I think that case of Myrtle Fillmore is a clear case of chemicalization and being rocketed to that pearl of great price. Let me move it even a little closer in terms of time. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson was the typhoon of Wall Street in the 1920s. And then alcoholism laid him low. By the 1930s, Bill Wilson was an unemployable drunk bum. He was locked up in Towns Hospital in New York City. He overheard a conversation the doctor was having with his wife, Lois. The doctor said to Lois, your husband, he's going to die a wet brain. He's going to die probably a pretty excruciating alcoholic death, and it's probably going to come pretty soon. Bill overheard that, and in desperation called out and said, if there's anything there, help. And it was at that point that Bill experienced the bright winds of the Spirit, and he never drank again. Now, after he got out of Towns Hospital, Bill, I've had this great mountaintop experience and everything else like that. I feel my health coming back. One thing I don't have, says Bill, I don't have my financial, I'm no longer a financial blizzard, but I got to die. Do I have a scheme to get back on top? Bill's going to go to Akron, Ohio, and he's only 6 months sober. He's had this spiritual incline for 6 months. He's going to go to Akron, Ohio, and he's going to take over, he's going to manipulate the stock and take over a company. in Akron, Ohio, and then he'll be right back on the road to success. Well, what happens in Akron, Ohio? His deal to take over the company completely disintegrates as an utter failure. He winds up this close from taking a drink. And then through providence, he winds up with a drunk, an alcoholic doctor in Akron, Ohio by the name of Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was a rectal surgeon. How'd you like to be operated on by a drunk rectal surgeon? And it was through this meeting that founded Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step fellowships. And neither of them ever drank again. I think that is clearly an example of chemicalization, of going for the pearl of great price. Joseph Campbell, that great modern teacher of mythology, said that sometimes we have to let go of that life we planned so that we can have the life that is waiting there for us. Now, why do these hitches in our giddy app develop? I mean, why can't we just have this spiritual awakening and have the rocket take off and there's no O-ring problems and anything else like that? I think there are many reasons why we go through the process of chemicalization. I'd strongly recommend a wonderful book written by Dr. Robert Brummett, if you've not already read it, Finding Yourself in Transition, which really, I think does a wonderful job of talking this. But there are four things which and I don't claim this is an exclusive list, but I think there are at least four things which I'd like to say why I think sometimes we do go through this process of chemicalization. First, we heard the day's daily word. The day's daily word was about self-care. All too often, we're so great at caring for others, but we're not oftentimes all that great about self-care. A conversation I recently had with Reverend Aaron, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this with you, but anyway, Reverend Aaron looked up and said, so many of my minister friends are so great with compassion and everything else for other people, and yet they don't know how to show that same compassion and self-care towards themselves. In Unity ministerial process, you have to go through licensing and ordination exams, 4 of them, and you meet a panel and they give you questions and everything else like that. Well, I did it, came back, and my L&O committee said, Rick, you seem to have good biblical knowledge, you have all this going for you, we think you'll make a good minister and all that, but there's one thing, one but. The but they said is, you seem to us to be a clear case for ministerial burnout. And I'm thinking, I haven't even been made a minister yet, and they already have me burning out, But, I see that, what they were talking about. And so, I think one of the reasons we go through this a lot of times is because we're not giving ourselves this self-care. And I mentioned Debbie before. When Unity Worldwide Ministries asked me to serve on the committee that is looking at the task force, looking at the unification of Unity Worldwide Ministries and all that, of the Unity Institute, Debbie said to me, so what are you giving up? What position are you giving up? And, I can be one who, instead of being a human being a human doing and taking on. And I think, I'm working to develop that own internal voice of, you can take this on, but what are you giving up? What self-care are you giving yourself? Second reason, which I think a lot of times we go through this, or we need to go through this process of chemicalization, is that quite frankly, it's not just our own individual consciousness. I mean, our individual consciousness can be great in great shakes, but there's also collective consciousness. And the example which I would give would be Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a German psychiatrist, very famous, wrote Man's Search for Meaning, Jewish. and wound up in Auschwitz in a Nazi death camp. Well, did he wind up in a Nazi death camp because, he wished it, law of mind action, he wished it upon himself or what? No, I don't think that at all. I mean, for everything I know about Viktor Frankl, I don't think that is the case. I think that sometimes we can be in great shakes, but if you're living in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, it's not just your own individual consciousness. You also have to deal with the collective consciousness of the society that you're going through. Now, does that mean that the individual level doesn't mean anything? No, it meant everything. Viktor Frankl wrote about and said that those in Nazi death camps who essentially all they were is, I'm the second violin of the Berlin Philharmonic. When that was taken away, when that was washed out, they fell to pieces. But those who had looked within and had developed that inner self-worth, that inner spirit, we call the Christ within, Buddha nature, Atman, higher self, but developing that, those were the ones that had the spiritual wherewithal to survive and go through, actually go through Nazi death camps. And quite frankly, it was through this experience that Viktor Frankl had, where he was not only to be of service to himself, he was also to be of service to others going through the death camps. And later writing about it, this is where we get his great classic, Man's Search for Meaning, probably the most important. So a lot of times I think we go through these. It may not be because of something the disciples asked Jesus, why does this man have his problems? Is it because of him or is it because of a sin his parents did? Jesus looked at the disciples and said neither. It was for neither reason. Sometimes we go through these long, dark nights of the soul because it isn't just our consciousness, it's also having to deal with collective consciousness. But when our individual consciousness is in good shape, the analogy I think of is of Noah and the ark. The floods may come, but there will be an ark which will take us through. There will be an ark which take us through. The last reason of thinking about, well, why do we have to go through these experiences of long, dark nights of the soul and chemicalization? I think that a lot of times life can appear to us to be like a random number generator. Now, it's, you look at chaos theory and complexity theory, if you go to a higher order, what may appear to be random patterns, a lot of times there's a higher order to it. And I do believe that once you break through the clouds, and if you can take the vantage point of above the clouds, there is this order to it. But a lot of times, day to day, we're below the clouds, and it appears to us to be like a random number generator. And we go through this, and it is, my spiritual mentor, Reverend E.J. Niles, said to me, we really start to get someplace when we stop asking, why did this happen to me? And we start really asking ourselves, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from this? And so I think it really all boils down to essentially, these points. First, just expect that there will be times when there will be a hitch in our giddy-up. We're not always going to get the pass, go and collect $200 card. Sometimes we have to go through that process of chemicalization and through those long, dark nights of the soul. Second, when we face these difficult times and challenges, it does not have to mean that we are defeated. It can mean that a process of chemicalization is happening and that a pearl of great price is in the process of forming. Pain oftentimes is a touchstone to spiritual progress. I wish it were different, but that oftentimes appears to be the case. And third, we do not have to go through these long, dark nights of the soul alone. In fact, Paul's words can really come true for us. Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You want to talk about long, dark nights of the soul? Let me tell you about adoption. It was 4 years of hell for Debbie and me going through the process of adoption. We dealt with, shall I put it nicely, some very difficult birth mothers. We got calls constantly would get calls in the middle of the night from Nigeria. We had healthcare professionals, lawyers, and others come up to us and say, "Oh, you're too old to adopt." We had one lawyer come up to Debbie and say, "You had cancer. How can you even think of adopting?" And yet, we kept on keeping on in prayer, visioning, and following this service, Debbie and I are going to go to the Unity Village Chapel Nursery, and we're going to pick up our pearl of great price, our 10-month-old daughter, Therese, and this adoption has just been finalized by the courts. That great Unity teacher, Eric Butterworth, said that our first job is not to set things right. Our first job is to see things right. To see things right. And when we do that, we can know that through the process of chemicalization, we will be taken to a land beyond our wildest dreams. Thank you, and God bless.